April 15, 1943. The clouds over the French coast parted like curtains, revealing a silent theatre of war below. 20,000 feet above enemy territory, Major Donald Blakesley's gloved hand gripped the control stick of his P-47 Thunderbolt. His eyes narrowed behind the goggles as a dark silhouette broke through the haze beneath. It wasn't just another training drill. This was real. After weeks of mechanical failures and uneventful missions, Blakesley and his unit, men who had once flown nimble Spitfires under the RAF, were finally staring down the enemy. The 4th Fighter Group had struggled through a difficult transition. Their new aircraft, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, had been mocked by their British counterparts as 7-ton milk bottles. It was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter the world had seen. But as Blakesley locked onto a German Focke-Wulf 190 through his gun sight, the true purpose of this steel behemoth became clear. At 300 yards, he pressed the trigger. 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns roared to life, sending a storm of bullets, armor-piercing and incendiary, into the sky. Each second released more than 100 projectiles, forming a glowing stream that seemed more like a solid beam than a scatter of bullets. The German fighter didn't stand a chance. It exploded in mid-air, vanishing in a cloud of smoke and metal. It was the P-47's first aerial victory. This wasn't just another dogfight, it was a turning point. America's aviation philosophy had just been validated. While German engineers prioritized precision, weight reduction, and efficiency, the Americans had built a flying fortress capable of absorbing punishment and dishing out overwhelming firepower. And for the first time, the enemy saw what industrial abundance truly looked like in the sky. That victory didn't happen overnight. Just a month earlier, on March 10th, the P-47 had flown its first combat mission, a simple sweep over France. Radio malfunctions forced them to abort and replace their gear with British systems. The learning curve was steep. The Thunderbolt was twice as heavy as the Messerschmitts it would face, and its complex systems demanded a new approach to flying. But what it lacked in elegance, it made up for in brute strength. Back home, Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, was rolling out these monsters at breakneck speed, one every 4 hours. Alexander Kartveli, the P-47's Georgian-born designer, had envisioned something revolutionary. His idea wasn't about agility or dogfighting finesse. It was about dominance, through firepower, armor, and above all, production. Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group understood the assignment. His squadron arrived in England in January and would become the only unit to fly the P-47 exclusively through the end of the war. Their mission was clear: bring overwhelming power to the skies. And in Blakesley's hands, on that cold April day, the mission had begun. What happened in that moment, those few seconds of trigger time, marked more than a victory. It signaled the rise of a new combat doctrine. Not precision over minimalism, but abundance over scarcity. America wasn't just bringing new planes to the war, it was bringing a new kind of warfare, one forged in factories, delivered through the roar of synchronized Brownings, and etched forever in the skies over Europe. And as Major Blakesley banked his Thunderbolt back toward England, leaving smoke behind him and adrenaline in his veins, he might not have known that he had just rewritten the rules of air combat. But the men who faced him next would understand. They'd see the glowing lines in the sky and hear the thunder, and they would know. The game had changed. The days that followed Major Blakesley's victory confirmed what many in the Allied command had hoped for. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a heavy bird. It was a force multiplier. On April 17th, just 2 days after the first confirmed kill, the 4th Fighter Group was tasked with their first bomber escort mission. It didn't go perfectly. The limited range of early drop tanks forced the Thunderbolts to turn back earlier than planned, but the impact had already been made. German pilots, many veterans of the Battle of Britain, were stunned by the sheer volume of firepower the American fighters unleashed. Each P-47 carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, with 2,800 rounds on board. In practice, this meant over 100 rounds per second in a sustained burst, with every fifth round glowing as a tracer. To the Luftwaffe, it looked like they were flying into laser beams. The psychological toll was immediate. Even when no aircraft were hit, the barrage alone could send seasoned pilots diving for cover. Back at the Berlin Test Center in Germany, engineers pored over the remains of downed Thunderbolts. What they found disturbed them. Unlike the fragile precision machines they built at home, the American guns were brutally simple and shockingly effective. The Browning AM-2, designed back in 1933, had been mass-produced to such a degree that any part could be swapped between weapons without a single adjustment. That kind of standardization was unthinkable in German factories, where custom fitting and hand finishing was still the norm. The Luftwaffe had its own firepower, of course. The Focke-Wulf 190A5, Germany's frontline fighter, carried 2 machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. While each cannon shell packed more explosive power than a 50 cal bullet, their magazines only held 250 rounds per gun. That meant experienced German pilots flew into battle with barely 60 to 90 seconds of ammunition and were trained to fire in short, controlled bursts to conserve it. But conservation wasn't part of the American playbook. US pilots were taught to hold the trigger down and saturate the skies. They could afford to. Ammunition was shipped by the ton from America. A single group might have 500,000 components in reserve. By mid-1943, one large production facility in Missouri was making 1.6 billion components annually. That single location's output surpassed the combined total of all similar facilities in another region. In the field, the difference was remarkable. One group, already working at capacity, often operated with just a few days' worth of supplies. In contrast, the other side maintained 30-day reserves at their forward depots. They were highly active each day and used their resources as needed. When supplies ran low, new shipments arrived reliably by sea and rail. The engine of this major undertaking wasn't just in the air. It rumbled on assembly lines, moved through loading docks, and echoed in the great production halls. The Germans began adjusting their tactics. They had to. Traditional dogfighting techniques were suicidal against the Thunderbolt's wall of fire. The only way to survive was to dive, dodge, and pray. But even that was dangerous. Flying through a P-47's firing arc was like trying to walk through a waterfall of bullets. And so the psychological shift began. Luftwaffe pilots, once bold and confident, began calculating risk. Engagements were weighed carefully. Some chose not to engage at all. Because now every time they saw the stout profile of a Thunderbolt in the sky, they knew what was coming. It wasn't just a dogfight anymore. It was an industrial machine, a weaponized factory in flight, and it never ran out of bullets. By May of 1943, the tides in the air were shifting, not because of a breakthrough in German tactics or a dramatic increase in Luftwaffe numbers, but because the Americans had found their rhythm. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a curiosity in the skies. It was a proven predator. Every mission refined the strategy. American pilots were beginning to master the art of leveraging the P-47's strengths, its speed in a dive, its brutal firepower, and its near-mythic durability. The lessons came fast. Engage from altitude. Use the dive to your advantage. Don't worry about precision. Volume wins. This was a new way of fighting, born not in the traditions of aerial duels, but in the mechanics of mass production. German intelligence, always meticulous, had underestimated the P-47's capabilities from the beginning. Their analysts couldn't believe that a single-engine fighter could carry 8 heavy machine guns. It seemed illogical by their standards. They had spent years perfecting lightweight aircraft, optimizing fuel loads, shaving off grams of excess weight. The Thunderbolt threw all of that away in favor of brute strength and survivability. To the Germans, it was an absurd design. To the Americans, it was perfect. Every aspect of the P-47 told a story of industrial power. The turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine alone weighed as much as some entire German fighters. But that same engine allowed the Thunderbolt to climb and fight at 30,000 feet, well above the altitude where German engines began to gasp. The P-47 was heavy, yes, but its power-to-weight ratio matched or surpassed its sleeker opponents. More importantly, it could take hits, dozens of them, and still get home. The philosophy behind the Thunderbolt was spreading. Colonel Hubert Zemke and his 56th Fighter Group were quickly building a reputation as the most lethal squadron in the theater. They didn't dance with the enemy. They overwhelmed them. Zemke knew that the key wasn't outmaneuvering the Germans, it was outlasting them. His pilots trained relentlessly, pushing their aircraft to the limits, and when they went up, they brought hell with them. It wasn't just about air-to-air combat anymore. As the months wore on, American commanders realized that the Thunderbolt could do more than protect bombers. It could hunt. It could destroy trains, convoys, rail yards. With its armor-piercing incendiary rounds, a single P-47 could set an entire line of supply ablaze in seconds. Dive, fire, climb, repeat. The mission profile was simple. The effect was devastating. On the ground, the scale of support was almost surreal. Entire factories existed to keep the Thunderbolt flying. Spare engines, gun mounts, propellers, everything was built in excess. If a plane was damaged, it was patched and sent back up. If it was beyond repair, parts were stripped and reused. The goal wasn't perfection, it was continuity. Keep the skies filled with Thunderbolts and the enemy couldn't breathe. And the enemy was beginning to suffocate. Luftwaffe pilots who once had the luxury of calculated attacks now found themselves cornered, reacting instead of acting. The cost of each mission grew heavier. Where once they flew with confidence, now they flew with caution, peering constantly over their shoulders for that hulking American shadow and the streak of fire it carried. In the summer of 1943, the P-47 wasn't just a weapon, it was a message, a declaration that the war would not be won by elegance or efficiency, but by the relentless grind of industry, by systems that worked, by numbers that couldn't be denied. And every time a Thunderbolt emerged from the clouds, the message was delivered in fire and steel. August 17, 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. It was supposed to be a decisive blow against Germany's ball-bearing factories and aircraft manufacturing. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses lifted off in tight formations, engines thundering, their bellies filled with high-explosive promises. The P-47 Thunderbolts were there too, standing guard. Escorting the bombers into the heart of Germany was no easy task. The early drop tanks, holding just 75 gallons, limited the Thunderbolt's range to about 375 miles from their English bases. The mission planners knew this, but they gambled anyway, hoping that the window without escort would be brief. It wasn't. Once the P-47s reached their limit and turned back, the Luftwaffe struck. Waves of German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, pounced on the vulnerable B-17s. 60 bombers were lost in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded or captured. It was one of the bloodiest air battles of the war. But even in that carnage, the Thunderbolt made its presence known. Within their operational range, the P-47s proved merciless. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 17 kills without losing a single plane. Their firepower turned the tide in localized fights, creating bubbles of air superiority where German fighters simply disintegrated. But the message was clear. Range mattered. No matter how strong the escort, if it couldn't stay with the bombers to the target and back, the cost would be unsustainable. The engineers got to work. Larger external fuel tanks, first 108 gallons, then 150, were developed and deployed within months. By October, Thunderbolts could stretch their wings to 425 miles. It wasn't enough to reach Berlin yet, but it was enough to force the Luftwaffe to adjust. German controllers, who once waited patiently for the American fighters to turn back before attacking, now found themselves holding longer and flying farther just to reach the bombers. Every mile the Thunderbolt could extend its reach, the safer the bombers became. Every fuel tank attached meant fewer Germans could take off and return without burning precious reserves. Germany's internal logistics were under pressure, and now their fighter units were being stretched thin, not just by combat losses, but by the very act of chasing American formations deeper into the continent. Behind all of this was the relentless American supply chain. Massive stockpiles of ammunition, fuel and spare parts were built up across forward airfields in England. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, cycling damaged planes through repairs with the efficiency of factory lines. A P-47 could be patched up, rearmed, and airborne again within hours. The Luftwaffe couldn't match it. Their fighters operated with razor-thin reserves. Spare parts were salvaged from wrecks. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel, increasingly synthetic and of dubious quality, was running low. It was a war of attrition, and the Americans were winning not just in the air, but on every production floor back home. The Schweinfurt raid was a brutal lesson, but a necessary one. It exposed the limits of even the most powerful fighter, if not supported by logistics and range. and it lit a fire under Allied command. The solution wasn't to fly fewer missions, it was to expand the reach of their fighters, refine escort tactics, and keep pressing forward. Because every time a P-47 turned back for lack of fuel, dozens of bombers paid the price. And every time one stayed just a few minutes longer, it meant fewer German fighters made it home. The Thunderbolt had the guns, now it was racing to have the legs, and when it did, the skies over Germany would never be the same again. By October 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from an overbuilt oddity into a weapon of strategic consequence. With extended-range fuel tanks now commonplace, Thunderbolts were escorting bombers deeper into German-held territory, leaving less and less breathing room for the Luftwaffe. The hunters had become the hunted. The Germans tried to adapt. New tactics emphasized using the Focke-Wulf 190's superior roll rate and low-altitude agility. Instead of head-on attacks, pilots attempted slashing strikes from below, diving through formations before the Thunderbolts could react. But there was a catch. To reach the bombers, they still had to pass through the P-47's kill zone. And that zone was widening. With all 8 Browning machine guns converging at 250 yards, a Thunderbolt could saturate a small airspace with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't about precision shooting, it was about volume. A single 1-second burst delivered over 100 half-inch projectiles, more than enough to shred any aircraft that wandered into range. The Germans, trained to conserve ammo with quick, disciplined bursts, couldn't compete with the sheer output. The contrast was becoming more apparent with each dogfight. German pilots went up with barely a minute's worth of firing time. American pilots could hold the trigger down for 30, even 35 seconds. It didn't sound like much, but in a sky filled with flak, tracers, and screaming engines, that was an eternity. That was dominance. Forward airfields in England resembled small cities. Each P-47 group operated with an astonishing reserve, millions of rounds stockpiled, dozens of engines ready for swap-out, and crews trained to rebuild an aircraft overnight. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was cannibalizing wrecks just to keep squadrons airworthy. Their logistics had buckled under the weight of Allied bombing. Fuel depots burned, rail lines were twisted heaps of metal. Replacement parts trickled in, if at all. The psychological toll grew heavier by the day. German pilots who once chased bombers with confidence now feared the moment the Thunderbolts appeared. They had seen what happened to their comrades: engines torn apart mid-air, wings shorn off in bursts of fire, and parachutes that didn't always open in time. The P-47 didn't just kill aircraft, it erased the margin for error. Colonel Hubert Zemke understood this and leaned into it. He revised engagement protocols to maximize firepower. Instead of tight formations, he ordered wide, overlapping coverage, what he called the fan. Each squadron swept across the skies, their fields of fire merging into a net no enemy fighter could pass through unscathed. His men didn't chase kills, they denied space. October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday. Another bombing raid on Schweinfurt. P-47s escorted the bombers to their limits, shooting down 21 enemy fighters. But once they turned back, the bombers were ravaged again. The lesson was clear: air superiority wasn't enough. What was needed was air dominance, across the entire route, all the way to the target and back. Still, the Luftwaffe was beginning to crack. Even the most skilled pilots couldn't outmaneuver the math. A squadron of 12 German fighters might carry 7,000 rounds total. A single P-47 squadron with 16 aircraft carried over 44,000 rounds of heavy ammunition. And they weren't flying in fear. They were flying in waves, with replacements always waiting back at base. The sky was no longer a dueling ground. It was a killing field shaped by supply chains, factories, trees, and relentless training. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane, it was the physical manifestation of American industry, and it was rewriting the very nature of aerial warfare. As autumn gave way to winter in 1943, the mission of the P-47 Thunderbolt began to shift. Escorting bombers had proven critical, but the Thunderbolt's true strength lay not just in protecting formations, but in destroying everything that moved beneath them. The Army Air Forces quickly expanded the P-47's role to include ground attack. With its heavy armor, rugged airframe, and massive firepower, The Thunderbolt was the perfect tool to tear apart Germany's transportation network. What began as a fighter was becoming a flying artillery piece. Pilots learned new tactics, 30-degree dives on rail lines, opening fire at 1,000 yards, and walking their rudders to scatter bullets across the target. A single 10-second pass could rip through an entire train. Boilers exploded, freight cars ignited, vehicles were flipped and shredded by waves of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The P-47 didn't just hit targets, it erased them. By the end of 1943, the effect was devastating. German commanders began issuing standing orders to avoid rail movement during daylight hours. Locomotives were hidden in tunnels or camouflaged under trees. But it didn't matter. The Thunderbolts were relentless. If something moved, it burned. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's ability to respond continued to erode. The loss of experienced pilots was only part of the problem. The deeper issue was training. While American pilots entered combat with over 400 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery drills, German trainees were being rushed into battle with barely 100 hours in the cockpit. Some had never even fired their weapons in flight before facing the Americans. The result was tragic and predictable. Inexperienced German pilots flying outgunned and under-maintained aircraft were being slaughtered in the skies. They faced Thunderbolt pilots who had fired more ammunition in training than most Germans would fire in their entire combat careers. It wasn't a fair fight. It was industrial warfare applied to the air. One name began to stand out among the Americans: Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, a Polish-American with an instinct for aerial combat. Gabreski would go on to become the top P-47 ace in the European theater. When asked how he managed so many kills, his answer was simple. "We didn't need to be better shots. We needed to put our sight on them and hold the trigger down. 850s did the rest." His sentiment reflected the broader American philosophy: reliability over finesse, overwhelming force over subtlety. The Browning machine guns, refined for mass production, rarely jammed. The ammunition belts were perfectly engineered to feed continuously, allowing for long, uninterrupted streams of fire. German guns, often using drum magazines or complex feed systems, simply couldn't match that consistency, especially in the freezing altitudes where so many battles took place. Thunderbolts dominated not because they danced through the sky like acrobats, but because they didn't have to. They soared high, dropped down fast, and brought with them the kind of violence that left nothing behind. Bridges, trains, convoys, airfields, everything was fair game. And the Germans, stretched thin and battered from all sides, were running out of ways to fight back. The winter of 1943 marked a turning point. Not a single moment or battle, but a creeping realization across the German military. The skies no longer belonged to them. Every sunrise brought with it the low hum of distant engines. Every convoy looked upward in fear. And every burst of tracers from a diving Thunderbolt wasn't just a threat, it was the sound of a war being lost from above. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was a symbol of American resolve, of industrial might, and of a war machine that was only gaining speed. The aircraft itself had evolved too. New variants like the P-47 D-25 featured bubble canopies for better visibility, paddle blade propellers for improved performance, and racks for rockets beneath the wings. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a gunship, it was an all-purpose tool of destruction. With its new configuration, the P-47 could carry 3,400 rounds, 425 per gun. It could also deliver rockets, bombs, and strafing fire with surgical or sweeping devastation. In the skies above Europe, it was becoming harder to find a battlefield untouched by its influence. And then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. The scale of the invasion was unprecedented. As thousands of Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the skies above them roared with the presence of American air power. The P-47 Thunderbolts flew 2,398 sorties on that single day. They claimed 84 enemy aircraft in the air and another 89 on the ground. But the true impact lay not in the number of kills, but in the paralysis they imposed. German ground movement came to a grinding halt. Roads were ambush corridors, rail lines were smoking ruins. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, managed just 319 sorties over Normandy that day. American aircraft, over 13,000. The numbers told the story, but the sound told the emotion. That distinctive whistling moan of a diving thunderbolt, air rushing through gunports and ducts, became a terror weapon. German soldiers began ducking for cover at any sound overhead, unsure whether the aircraft was friend or foe, or whether they'd live through the next 5 seconds. The psychological war had reached full force, and even as German aircraft production peaked in late 1944, churning out over 25,000 fighters that year, the reality on the ground told a different tale. Fuel shortages meant many of those planes never even left the ground. Others were flown by poorly trained pilots, sent up with minimal gunnery hours, facing American veterans with hundreds of combat missions behind them. The numbers were staggering. German squadrons might possess 200,000 rounds of aircraft ammunition across an entire theater. A single American air group operating P-47s carried millions and could receive more by sea within days. Where the Germans calculated risk with every sortie, American pilots flew multiple missions a day, refueled, rearmed, and rotated out for rest. The Luftwaffe flew until it broke. Thunderbolt pilots didn't just carry guns. They carried the full weight of an industrial empire, factories operating day and night, supply lines stretching across oceans, rail yards loaded with crates of ammunition, engines, oil, and spare parts. And those parts were not scarce. If a P-47 returned riddled with holes, it could be flying again the next day. If a German fighter was hit, it was often stripped for parts, its airframe abandoned. This difference wasn't just mechanical, it was mental. American pilots had confidence. They flew knowing they had support, fuel, firepower, and time. German pilots flew knowing that every gallon burned might not be replaced, that every bullet fired was one less in the depot, and that their days were measured not in victories, but in narrow survival. The Thunderbolt had become more than a tool of war. It was a declaration that America had committed its full industrial and human force to the fight. And every time it screamed out of the sky, guns blazing, it announced that the balance of power in Europe had irreversibly shifted. By the closing months of 1944, the transformation of air combat was complete. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, was now a shadow of its former self. Their jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-T-62s were marvels of technology, yes, but they were few, fragile, and often ineffective against fighters like the P-47. Speed alone could not overcome the limits of ammunition, training, and strategic depth. The Thunderbolt still ruled the skies. One of the clearest signs of the shift was found not in the air, but in the supply depots. While German fighters like the FW-190 had once carried 4 cannons and machine guns, by late 1944, many were flying with only 2 cannons. Ammunition was simply too scarce. Every round counted. Every engagement was a calculation in conservation. And in that kind of fight, the Americans held every advantage. The P-47N, developed for the Pacific Theater, was perhaps the most radical evolution of the Thunderbolt. It carried 550 gallons of internal fuel, more than some German bombers. It was a single-seat fighter, yet it could fly farther, hit harder, and carry more ordnance than most aircraft of its class anywhere in the world. It symbolized what American engineering could achieve when given time, space, and resources. The numbers by now were breathtaking. Republic Aviation's factories, massive complexes in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, covered over 1 million square feet. By the end of the war, over 15,600 P-47s had been built. At peak, production reached over 400 aircraft per month. Each one rolled off the line with 8 fully equipped guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition. In comparison, total FW-190 fighter variant production throughout the war hovered around 13,000. German assembly plants were constantly bombed, their workers exhausted, their output inconsistent. While American workers, many of them women, built aircraft with standardized tools in climate-controlled conditions, Germany relied increasingly on forced labor in deteriorating factories. Sabotage, low morale, and shortages plagued their production. The Lake City Army ammunition plant in Missouri alone was producing 1.6 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition annually. And that was just one facility. The total US output of 50 cal rounds during the war exceeded 10 billion. Germany's total aircraft ammunition production across all calibers during the war, barely 4 billion. And the quality control couldn't have been more different. American rounds underwent rigorous inspection. If a bullet varied more than 1/1000th of an inch, it was rejected. German rounds, made from inferior metals and often by undertrained labor, frequently misfired. That meant in combat, a German pilot might pull the trigger and hear silence. An American pilot, by contrast, heard thunder every time. The Thunderbolt's durability continued to astound both friend and foe. Colonel Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group once limped back to base in a P-47 that had absorbed over 200 hits. The aircraft's fuselage was riddled, the canopy was shattered, control surfaces were damaged. But the engine kept running. The Thunderbolt brought him home. That wasn't an exception, it was the rule. The design that had once been mocked as a flying tank had proven that sometimes weight and strength were exactly what a pilot needed. The Germans learned this lesson too late. Their own planes, optimized for agility and precision, crumpled under sustained fire. And as the Allied bombing intensified, those same lightweight fighters could no longer even reach the skies in meaningful numbers. The war was shifting irrevocably. From the skies to the factories, from dogfights to supply lines, from precision to production. And at the heart of it all flew the P-47, unapologetically massive, thunderously loud, and relentlessly effective. It wasn't just winning battles, it was redefining how wars were fought and won in the modern age. The deeper historians and commanders looked into the war effort, the more the numbers told a story that words could barely contain. The United States hadn't simply built a fighter, it had built an airborne engine of war that fused firepower, durability, and mass production into one unstoppable force. The statistics were staggering. The US Strategic Bombing Survey would later reveal that P-47s destroyed nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, over 3,200 on the ground, and obliterated tens of thousands of trains, vehicles, and armored targets. These weren't inflated figures, they were the measurable outcome of a doctrine that favored industrial quantity and reliable delivery over boutique engineering. P-47 squadrons systematically dismantled Germany's transportation infrastructure. Rail yards were cratered, bridges collapsed under explosive barrages, entire armored columns were turned to smoking wreckage before they ever reached the front lines. German units began to avoid daylight movement altogether, not because of fear, but because of certainty. Certainty that if they moved, they'd be spotted, strafed, and annihilated. The Luftwaffe's inability to counter these attacks meant the American airmen had achieved something rarely seen in warfare: total air impunity. Thunderbolts flew low and fast, laying waste to supply chains without serious resistance. German anti-aircraft batteries, though deadly, couldn't be everywhere. And with the P-47's tough construction and the skill of its pilots, even damaged aircraft often returned safely. The human element cannot be ignored. American pilots, trained extensively and rotated home after fixed combat tours, flew with confidence. They knew that if they survived their 25 or later 35 missions, they'd go home to train the next wave. German pilots, in contrast, flew until they were killed, wounded, or captured. There was no limit. No break. The Luftwaffe began bleeding out its experience faster than it could replace it. By late 1944, most German pilots in the air were fresh, inadequately trained, and flying machines maintained by crews scrambling for spare parts. American P-47 groups maintained 85% serviceability on average. German units struggled to keep even half their aircraft operational. The disparity only widened with time, but it wasn't just about who had more, it was about how they used it. American training emphasized system-wide learning. Every combat experience was studied, every tactic refined. Pilots were not just brave, they were prepared. Instructors brought real lessons from the front lines back to the training bases. The evolution was constant. Technological upgrades followed suit. The K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, introduced in late 1944, allowed pilots to aim by framing their target. The system did the complex math of deflection and lead. German aircraft, by contrast, still relied on traditional reflector sights, requiring guesswork and manual adjustment in high-speed, high-altitude dogfights. Even the P-47's gun systems had advantages in harsh conditions. Special heating systems prevented the guns from freezing at altitude, ensuring reliable function at 60 degrees. German wing-mounted guns frequently failed above 25,000 feet, putting pilots at a lethal disadvantage during high-altitude escort missions. This level of preparedness and resilience didn't come from luck. It came from a deliberate, coordinated effort, one that fused military necessity with industrial genius. The Thunderbolt was never the prettiest aircraft in the sky, but it was always the one to beat. And as the war dragged on, it became clear to every German soldier and pilot alike, beating it wasn't just hard, it was increasingly impossible. Wherever a P-47 appeared, it brought with it more than bullets and bombs. It brought the weight of a nation that had turned its factories into fortresses, its workers into warriors, and its skies into strongholds. And there was no escaping the thunder. By the final stretch of 1944, even the most hardened German commanders had to face an uncomfortable truth. The skies over Europe were lost, not only to Allied bombers, but to the tireless, thundering guardians that escorted them, the P-47 Thunderbolts. American ground crews had perfected a rhythm that bordered on choreography. Engines were replaced overnight. Bullet-ridden airframes were patched and flight-ready within hours. The availability of spare parts was so extensive that squadrons could rebuild a Thunderbolt from scratch without waiting on central depots. Pilots took off in aircraft restored by hands that worked not just with skill, but with urgency and pride. On the German side, the situation was bleak. Airfields were under constant attack. Spare parts were scarce. Many maintenance crews, once composed of seasoned mechanics, were now filled with youth corps and conscripted laborers. Training was minimal. Tools were improvised. Fuel, perhaps the most critical resource, was running dry. Without fuel, fighters couldn't fly. Even the most advanced designs were reduced to static displays, and when German pilots did take to the air, they did so with heavy hearts. Every maneuver burned fuel that might not be replaced. Every sortie risked an aircraft that could not be repaired. Aggressive tactics were no longer a matter of strategy, they were a luxury Germany could no longer afford. American pilots, in contrast, flew like they were born to it. They took risks. They pressed advantages. They climbed high and dove fast, knowing that fuel and firepower were never in question. This confidence, rooted in abundance, became its own kind of weapon. It made them bolder, sharper, deadlier. The fuel equation alone spoke volumes. German fighters were often allotted 30 to 50 gallons per mission, barely enough for a round trip, let alone a drawn-out engagement. P-47s carried 370 gallons internally, with external drop tanks expanding their reach even farther. It was a difference not just in capacity, but in mindset. Americans planned for endurance, Germans hoped for survival. This disparity shaped every tactical decision. German fighters could not afford prolonged dogfights. They had to strike fast and escape, praying their calculations were correct. But Thunderbolts, with their massive fuel reserves, could wait. They could chase. They could circle until their enemies exhausted both options and fuel. Even the weapons themselves revealed the growing gap. The Me-262 jet fighter, the supposed wonder weapon of the Reich, was fast, but its 4 30mm cannons carried just 80 to 100 rounds each. It was built to destroy bombers, not engage agile escorts. Against a Thunderbolt, it lacked staying power, and once its brief ammunition load was spent, it was defenseless. The Germans continued to innovate. New variants of the FW-190 carried more guns, heavier armor, but every addition came at a cost: speed, range, maneuverability. Meanwhile, the P-47, already a flying brick by traditional standards, absorbed these upgrades with ease. Rockets, bombs, drop tanks, it handled them all without sacrificing its role as a fighter. The skies were not only louder with the roar of thunderbolts, they were brighter. Fields of tracer fire lit up the heavens. Germans began to describe them as walls of light, impossible to pass through without being torn apart. It wasn't just air superiority anymore. It was air dominance, unquestioned, unmatched. And as the American war machine continued to ramp up, producing more aircraft, more bullets, more trained pilots, The Luftwaffe found itself overwhelmed not just by firepower, but by scale. They weren't just losing a battle, they were losing the very concept of control. The sound of 8 synchronized Brownings had become more than thunder. It had become the voice of inevitability, a voice that said, loud and clear, "The skies no longer belong to you." As 1945 dawned over a war-torn Europe, the P-47 Thunderbolt had firmly entrenched itself as one of the most defining weapons of the Allied arsenal. Its role extended far beyond escort and interdiction. It was now the spearhead of a campaign to paralyze the German war machine at its core. Logistics, movement, and morale. With the Luftwaffe crippled and fewer German fighters taking to the skies, Thunderbolts turned their fury downward. Roads, rail lines, factories, and supply convoys became prime targets. The ground crews knew what to expect each morning. Rows of P-47s roaring off the tarmac, loaded with bombs, rockets, and nearly 3,500 rounds of 50 caliber firepower. They didn't fly to duel, they flew to destroy. The scale of destruction became unprecedented. P-47s wiped out 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 rail cars, and over 68,000 vehicles throughout the campaign. German forces began abandoning equipment just to avoid being seen. Movement during daylight hours became a gamble with death. Soldiers described the fear not of the enemy in front of them, but of the whistling sound overhead. That dreadful moan meant the Thunderbolts were diving. This fear was no illusion. A standard attack profile saw P-47s diving at 30 degrees, unleashing up to 1,000 rounds in under 10 seconds. With rudder pedals rocked side to side, their bullets sprayed wide across targets, ensuring even a missed aim resulted in devastation. A single pass could level a convoy or obliterate an entire train. Multiple passes were rarely needed, and unlike the desperate, under-resourced attacks of the Luftwaffe, these missions were executed with calculated precision and near-endless support. American depots were brimming with replacement parts, engines, weapons. If a Thunderbolt took damage, it didn't mean downtime. It meant a quick turnaround. If a mission called for extra rockets or fuel tanks, they were installed by nightfall. Meanwhile, German forces were digging deeper into their own graves. Fuel was nearly exhausted. Cannibalization became standard maintenance. Many pilots now flew with guns that hadn't been test-fired, uncertain if they would even function in combat. The Luftwaffe's serviceability rate dropped below 50%. For every American pilot enjoying a well-earned rotation stateside, a German pilot faced the grim certainty of a final mission. Ground crews told similar stories. In the US, mechanics received months of technical schooling. In Germany, the ranks were being filled by teenagers and foreign laborers with minimal training. American crew chiefs were problem solvers, trained to rebuild entire aircraft overnight. Their German counterparts were just trying to keep engines from freezing. Technological superiority played a role, but it was the system that made it unstoppable. American logistics functioned like a living organism, fluid, fast, and responsive. Factories communicated with frontline units. Tactical lessons turned into production changes within weeks. If a problem emerged in the field, a solution followed. While Germany had genius engineers and brave pilots, they lacked time and resources. Innovation was not enough when the skies were flooded with fighters carrying more ammunition than entire Luftwaffe units could muster. Precision gave way to pressure, talent gave way to tide. And as American pilots soared across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, they understood the new rhythm of the war. The enemy was no longer a plane in the sky, it was the infrastructure below. Rail junctions, supply columns, fuel depots, and every time a P-47 leveled its wings and dropped into a dive, another link in Germany's war machine was severed. The Thunderbolt wasn't a surgical weapon. It was a blunt instrument forged from steel and sweat, swung with purpose by a nation that had turned its industry into an extension of its will. It didn't just hit targets, it made the enemy bleed resources, confidence, and hope. In the final months of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become more than just a machine of war. It had become the embodiment of American industrial might. Its very presence in the sky signaled not only firepower, but a depth of resources that Germany could no longer comprehend, let alone match. The legacy of the P-47 was not just measured in kill ratios or destroyed infrastructure. It was measured in the psychological shadow it cast. German pilots described the fire from its 850 caliber guns as a solid wall, an impenetrable curtain of death. To approach a formation of bombers protected by Thunderbolts was to flirt with suicide. Even experienced Luftwaffe aces began avoiding combat unless absolutely necessary. The statistics backed up their fear. The P-47 flew over 746,000 combat sorties in the European theatre. It maintained an astonishingly low loss rate, less than 0.5% per mission. In contrast, German fighter units were suffering 50% casualties per month by late 1944. Every flight for them became a coin toss with ever-diminishing odds. The 56th Fighter Group, under Colonel Hubert Zemke's aggressive leadership, became the top-scoring American unit in Europe. Flying the P-47 exclusively, they claimed 674 aerial victories. Zemke's tactics weren't about finesse, they were about saturation. His famed Zemke fan formation spread fighters wide, creating overlapping kill zones that no enemy could slip through untouched. He understood the aircraft's potential and used it to reshape aerial combat strategy. On the other side, German memoirs from the era echoed a growing despair. Heinz Knoke, a German ace, recalled the futility of trying to punch through Thunderbolt formations to reach bombers. The air was thick with tracers. His fellow pilots were often torn apart before they could even return fire. The Luftwaffe's traditional values, skill, timing, precision, had been rendered obsolete by firepower and numbers. And behind that firepower was a support system unlike anything the world had seen. Republic Aviation's factories, sprawling across acres of American soil, had produced thousands of Thunderbolts with shocking efficiency. Women comprised 40% of the workforce at the Farmingdale plant, working tirelessly under banners that read, "The plane you build today will fly tomorrow." At the Lake City ammunition plant, other women, often mothers and daughters, inspected bullets with micrometers and rejected anything outside of a 0.01-inch tolerance. These weren't just workers, they were quiet warriors, ensuring that every round fired from a Thunderbolt met the same exacting standard. Their hands, though far from the front, helped secure victory in every engagement. Meanwhile, German production was unraveling. Slave labor was increasingly used in desperate factories built into mountainsides or dispersed across occupied towns. Sabotage became common, the quality of materials declined, maintenance protocols collapsed. German aircraft were leaving the ground with misaligned guns, brittle wiring, and engines that barely held together. The American system wasn't just bigger, it was better, it was faster, it was more adaptive. And the Thunderbolt was its most fearsome messenger. Every time its 8 guns roared, they spoke with the voice of assembly lines, welders, machinists, and inspectors. They spoke for a nation that had turned production into precision, and precision into power. By early 1945, Germany's fate was sealed, not just by advancing Allied armies, but by the dominion of the skies. P-47s patrolled the air with impunity, striking at will, vanishing before any response could materialize. The battlefield had changed. No longer a chessboard of strategies, it had become a factory floor of overwhelming force. And through it all, the Thunderbolt kept flying, steadfast, unyielding, and utterly uncompromising. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany in 1945, the roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt echoed over shattered towns and fractured supply lines. Every Thunderbolt overhead was a message. The war was now being fought on America's terms. The German Air Force was a shell of its former self. Fuel was nearly non-existent. Pilots, often teenagers with only a few hours of flight time, were being thrown into outdated or hastily assembled aircraft. Their missions were no longer strategic. They were desperate acts of resistance against an overwhelming force that showed no signs of fatigue. American Thunderbolt squadrons, by contrast, were at peak performance. Their aircraft were modernized with every new variant. Their pilots rotated and rested, their crews stocked with parts and support. Morale was high, not because the war was easy, but because the system worked. Every day, American squadrons knew what they had to do, and they had everything they needed to do it. The last-ditch German attempts to build superweapons, jet fighters, rocket planes, advanced air-to-air missiles, came too late and in too few numbers. Even when these machines entered the battlefield, they were sabotaged by their own limitations: unreliable materials, undertrained pilots, meticulously, and dwindling fuel reserves. The Me-262, hailed as the future of air combat, was no match for the relentless tide of Thunderbolts and Mustangs operating in packs, cutting off runways before the jets could even take off. In contrast, the P-47 was peaking. The Pacific variant, the P-47N, had internal fuel capacity larger than some bombers. It could fly farther, longer, and carry more ordnance than any fighter of its kind. In every way, it embodied the American belief that enough of a good thing, firepower, speed, range, could become something unstoppable. And then there was the philosophy behind it all. While German designers pursued perfection, craftsmanship, technical elegance, custom assembly, American engineers pursued efficiency. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to be perfect, it was built to work. And work it did, across 2 continents and thousands of missions, from high-altitude dogfights to low-level strafing runs. Everything about the P-47 told the same story: industrial muscle triumphing over scarcity. Its ammunition, millions of rounds shipped monthly, came from factories that never stopped. Its engines, robust, consistent, powerful, could be replaced in hours. Its guns, reliable under ice and fire alike, never needed finesse to be effective. Even in its final months, the P-47 remained indispensable. Bombers depended on them. Infantry units cheered at their arrival. Enemy convoys scattered when they heard the whistle of a Thunderbolt's dive. There was no corner of the war zone where the Thunderbolt hadn't left its mark. And perhaps most telling of all, when West Germany rebuilt its air force in the 1950s, it didn't turn inward to reclaim its pre-war legacy. It turned to the United States. German pilots trained on American aircraft. They fired American ammunition. They studied American tactics. In every sense, the former masters of the air had become the students. That shift wasn't just strategic, it was philosophical. The old ideas of war, of limited duels, elegant machines, and outnumbered victories had been replaced by a new reality. Wars were now won by systems, by integration, by scale, and the P-47 had led the way into that new world, its 8 guns blazing a path not just through enemy formations, but through outdated doctrines. With every mission flown, every convoy destroyed, and every target eliminated, the P-47 had proven a simple truth. Strength isn't just about the machine, it's about what's behind it: the people, the factories, the will to finish the job. In the twilight of the war, as Allied forces converged on Berlin and the German Reich unraveled from within, the P-47 Thunderbolt remained an unrelenting presence in the skies. Its thunder was now familiar across the continent, a sound that meant death to convoys, panic to rail lines, and hope to the men on the ground wearing American uniforms. Even as victory became inevitable, the Thunderbolts didn't rest. Their missions became more surgical, more focused. They targeted what remained of Germany's industrial spine: fuel depots, weapons plants, and troop reinforcements. Entire towns would pause in fear at the sound of approaching engines. Civilians and soldiers alike had learned that when the Thunderbolt came, it came with finality. Behind the lines, the massive American logistical machine kept moving, undeterred. Republic Aviation's plants continued to produce aircraft at record pace, even when it was clear the war was nearing its end. The message was clear: the US would not slow down until victory was complete. If another year of fighting was required, they would double their output again. On the ground, American soldiers often looked up in awe as formations of P-47s passed overhead. It wasn't just air support, it was a reminder that they weren't alone. Those low-flying strafing runs, those bombs precisely dropped on enemy artillery positions, those sudden appearances of fighter bombers during tight battles, they changed outcomes, saved lives, and turned retreats into advances. The German military, fractured and desperate, resorted to scattered resistance. Some units surrendered outright, others tried to regroup in forests and mountain passes, but the skies offered no sanctuary. The Thunderbolt's range, speed, and firepower ensured that nowhere was truly safe. German officers wrote in their final dispatches of their helplessness against American air power, of attacks that came before breakfast, again at lunch, and once more before dusk. And when peace finally came, when the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared, the P-47 had earned a place in history not only as a fighter, but as a symbol of an era where production lines mattered as much as front lines, where skilled labor back home made as much impact as steel in the sky, where winning a war wasn't just about bravery, it was about systems, scale, and sustainability. From the dusty workshops in Missouri to the runways of southern England, from the cold skies over France to the burning roads of Germany, the P-47 Thunderbolt carried with it the weight of a nation's promise. A promise that it would do whatever it took to end the war. And it delivered on that promise with every round fired, every mission flown, every tank destroyed, and every train derailed. Even as the Mustang P-51 rose to prominence with its longer range and sleeker design, it never eclipsed what the Thunderbolt had achieved. The P-47 had paved the way. It had held the line when the enemy was strongest. It had bought the time, broken the back of the Luftwaffe, and turned the tide of a war not just through speed or agility, but through unyielding firepower and unmatched resolve. The P-47 didn't just change battles, it changed how battles were fought. Its legacy would echo not only through post-war aviation, but through every doctrine that valued scale, integration, and resilience. It wasn't perfection, but it was enough, and in war, enough delivered again and again is what wins. The thunder was fading now, but its impact would resonate for generations to come. The war ended not with a bang in the sky, but with silence on the ground. When the guns fell quiet and the last sortie was flown, the P-47 Thunderbolt had written its name not just into military history, but into the story of how a nation's will can be turned into steel, fire, and flight. Its 8 Browning machine guns were never just weapons. They were the end product of millions of hands working in unison. Engineers, machinists, assembly workers, supply clerks, fuel drivers. Every time a pilot squeezed the trigger, he wasn't acting alone. He was the final link in a chain that began in the heartland of America and stretched across oceans. That was the real lesson of the Thunderbolt. Not that it was the fastest, or the prettiest, or even the most elegant in combat, but that it was the right weapon for the moment. A moment that demanded not only force, but endurance. Not only skill, but overwhelming reliability. It was a weapon built on the idea that good enough, multiplied by thousands, beats perfect every time. In its wake, modern air combat was reborn. Rotary cannons, high-volume weapons, mass-standardized systems. They all trace their lineage back to the ideas forged in the smoke trails of the P-47. Even today, when modern jets scream overhead, their doctrine echoes what the Thunderbolt proved. That power delivered often, accurately, and in quantity is unbeatable. But beyond doctrine and statistics, there was something else the P-47 left behind. A lesson in what happens when a democratic nation channels its full industrial potential toward a singular cause. America didn't win the air war because of better pilots or luck. It won because it built systems that worked and scaled them beyond what its enemies could imagine. And for the Germans, that realization came too late. By the time they understood the significance of the 8 guns blazing from the wings of a Thunderbolt, they were already retreating. Theirs had been a war of constraints. America's was a war of capacity. In that mismatch, the outcome had been sealed before the first bullet flew. As the surviving pilots returned home, men like Gabby Gabreski and Robert Johnson, they brought with them stories of dogfights and near misses, of brotherhood and bravery. But above all, they carried with them the pride of knowing they flew a machine that represented more than air power. It represented what America could do when it stood united. Today, you can find Thunderbolts in museums on static display, their fuselages polished and wings spread wide. They are no longer instruments of war. They are monuments to what was achieved and reminders of what it took. The roar of their engines may be gone, but their legacy is written into every modern conflict, every combat doctrine, and every industrial playbook on how to fight and win a war of endurance. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt taught the world that firepower backed by industry can change the course of history. And that sometimes victory comes not from the sleekest design, but from the loudest voice, the heaviest wings, and the will to never stop flying forward. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What does the legacy of the Thunderbolt mean to you? We'd love to hear your reflections. Until next time, keep your eyes on the sky and remember the sound of victory.